streaming service. Can I ask parties to introduce themselves in turn? Could we start with those representing the applicant, please?
Thank you, sir. Good morning. My name is Marcus Trinick. I'm a solicitor of King's Counsel, instructed by Nicola Martin, a partner in Wright Johnson Mackenzie, who is with me in the room that you see on screen. And also in the room, please put up your hands, Simon Herriott, who's going to deal with planning. There's James Baird of the applicant company, Neil Thompson of the applicant company, and Amy McDougall of Wright Johnson Mackenzie.
Thank you very much. And Aberdeenshire Council?
Yes, so good morning. My name is James Finley, King's Counsel at the Scottish and English and Welsh bars. I'm instructed by Mr. McIntosh, who sits 2 down from me. Beside me, I have Elizabeth Tully, and at the end of the table is James Howard.
Thank you very much. And Mountaineer in Scotland?
It's good morning, sir. David Gordon, Mountaineering Scotland. May I say now that having attended something similar 2 days ago, I really have very little to contribute, and I'm quite content if the reporters ignore me unless I'm vigorously waving my hand. That may speak.
No problem. Thank you very much. And finally, Mr. Kelly, could you please introduce yourself and the estates that you represent?
Good morning, Sir. Ian Kelly, Ian Kelly Planning Consultancy Limited. I represent the listing of 8 estates set out in the hearing statement, largely surrounding the Windfarm site. Like Mr. Gordon, I have observed similar proceedings in the case of Contradwell, and I have read all the hearing statements. Unless you have specific questions for me, sir, I don't think I'll say much, but like Mr. Gordon, if I want to intervene, I'll stick my hand up in the usual way, sir. Thank you.
That's no problem. Thank you very much. So before we get underway, I'll just take a quick moment to talk through a little housekeeping. I do appreciate that you've all been involved in a couple of these virtual inquiries in recent times, but this is the first one in relation to this case. So as we're located in a variety of locations, we've found that it can help with the quality of the call if parties just ensure they're muted until invited to speak by either myself or Ms. Hayward. And if you do want to respond to a given point, as she said there, just raise your hand and we'll ensure you're given the opportunity to speak when the current speaker's finished. I do need to give a quick forewarning that I'm myself based right on the periphery at the moment, and unfortunately a fishing boat went through our broadband connection to my island on Sunday. So we've had some real problems with it in the first part of this week. It does appear to be quite stable at the moment, but if at any time I drop out or if I freeze, Ms. Hayward's going to keep control on my behalf. So as I mentioned, today's session is being webcast live through the DPA webcasting site, and in taking part, you're agreeing to being recorded. The recording will be available to the session and might also be stored for training purposes and to keep us a historic record of events. I've not planned a specific slot for a short break this morning, but we'll look to identify an appropriate point to pause in about an hour. I would hope that the session will conclude before lunchtime, and I am aware that certain participants may have other commitments this afternoon. The majority of my questions relate to NPF4, so don't get disheartened if we remain on item 2 for a while, looking at the agenda. If the discussion does run on for any reason and it doesn't look like we'll be able to draw things to a close by the expected time, we'll look to take a longer break, maybe around 1 o'clock. If for any reason anyone needs to take a short break, please do let us know and we'll look to pause at a convenient point. Does this sound reasonable? Thank you very much. In terms of the agenda for this morning, as you're all aware, today's additional session was arranged following the issue of the revised NPF4 in November and its subsequent approval by Parliament on the 11th of January. The document's yet to be formally adopted by ministers, but we do anticipate this will take place next month. Once adopted, NPF4 will replace NPF3 and SPP, becoming part of the statutory development plan. Although this is a Section 36 application and the development plan doesn't have primacy, as is the case with planning applications, it does remain material consideration in the determination of the proposal. So further to the updated NPF4, the onshore wind policy statement and a draft biodiversity strategy were published in December, followed by a draft energy strategy and just transition plan in January. The additional local plan, development plan was also updated. So we've had quite a change since the last session. We're holding this hearing in order the updated documents can be fully considered in the preparation of our report. So thank you to the applicant for updating the core documents list to incorporate all of these additional documents. Can I just get a nod from participants today to confirm everybody has access to these documents in case we need to refer to them? That's great, thank you. We're very grateful for your hearing statements, which refer to all of these documents. We don't intend to go through them in detail today or expect you to read them out in any way. The statements will be taken fully into consideration, along with the evidence presented today when we finalise our report for ministers. The purpose of today's session is to seek clarity on certain matters, in particular where there's a clear difference of opinion. Given the clarity of the hearing statements and the fact we have all of the relevant documents before us, we don't anticipate that we're going to require any closing submissions following the session. If we do feel any additional information is required, we'll let you know. We did receive some additional documents this week that were added to the core documents library, including the Brody's blog, the response to that from the applicant, and the letter from the chief planner. If participants wish to refer to those today when answering questions, that's acceptable, and everybody will be given an opportunity to respond. Before we start, does anybody have any questions about the process for today or the background to today's session? No. Thank you very much. So can I ask everyone to ensure that your mobile phones are just on silent, and we'll move on to item 2. So this section of the agenda focuses on NPF4. We fully considered the position of parties regarding part 1 of the document, the spatial strategy, and are satisfied we have enough information to factor this into our recommendations. However, before we look specifically at the key policy areas listed in the agenda, we'd like to give parties the opportunity in turn to respond to any of the points made within the submissions before us, if it's felt this isn't covered in your hearing statements. So I'm going to start with the applicant in this regard. Thank you.
So we're happy to go straight into the policies.
Okay. Mr. Finlay, does the council wish to make any additional comments on the spatial strategy based on the submission of the applicant?
No, we'll take the same view as Mr. Trunick.
And I know that you've indicated that you don't want to be asked every time, but just at this point, can I just check with Dr. Gordon and Mr. Kelly? Are you okay for us to proceed?
Yes, I'm content, sir.
Thank you. Okay, so first of all, we're going to look at policy 1, which is tackling the climate and nature crisis. Considering the policies in chronological order, we will start with policy 1, which states that when considering all development proposals, significant weight will be given to the global climate and nature crises. From reviewing the statements of the applicant and the council, it appears there's general agreement on the relevance of policy 1. However, whereas the applicant contends at 2.8, the language used in policy 1 marks a notable shift about the weight that should be given to these matters. The council at 2.2.5 of their statement argues there's no real difference in the underlying approach, given the removal of the former SPP presumption. So we'd firstly like to give the applicant and the council an opportunity to expand on their positions set out within the statements if desired, or to respond to what's been said within one another's submissions on the matter. And again, I'll start with you.
Yes, thank you, sir. Yes, I mean, I think, as you say, that's the fundamental difference between ourselves and the council on this. We do disagree with the remark in the council's hearing statement. There is arguably no real difference in the underlying approach set by policy 1. We think it marks a real shift in planning policy. Policy 1's an overarching policy. It's not subject specific, and it relates to all forms of development. And while it aligns with policy 11, which deals specifically with renewable energy, it goes further than policy 11 because it deals with the nature crisis, as well as the climate emergency. And the fact that we've got the wording in there that significant weight should be given to the global climate and nature crisis. It's the first time we've got that phrase or those words in national planning policy. Previous decisions, reporters, decision makers may well have given significant weight to these issues in deciding applications. The difference we consider is that previously there was an element of discretion. It was up to reporters and councils and other decision makers whether or not they give significant weight. The difference we've now got is in national policy, one, we're being told and decision makers are being told that these issues must be given significant weight in the planning balance. So there's still a balance to apply in the planning decision-making process, but in balancing these various factors, significant weight must now be given to these two crucial issues. And these are the twin pillars, really, that run through all of NPF4, through the policy intent, the policy outcomes, and the key links with other policies. And I think that when we look at individual policies as we go through, it's important to bring it back and look at the policy intent and the policy outcomes, which marks a deviation from what we have in SPP and NPF3.
Very much. And would the council like to respond or add anything at this point?
Yes, but just very briefly, I think there's nothing that, in effect, Mr. Herriot said, which we disagree with, but 2.2.5 has to be read in the context of our 2.2.3. We were intending to give a commentary on how it affects this proposal. Policy 1 clearly makes significant changes in equating the nature crisis with the climate crisis and the giving of weight. But so I think whilst there may appear to be a difference, there's the significance of the difference isn't that great. As Mr. Herriot described, there's no discretion now as to whether you give great weight to it. But that was never an issue between the parties, nor an issue that the council took in the first place. So that's why we have said it makes no real difference in the underlying approach. I can understand that the language may appear to be a bit broader than it is, but it has to be read in the context of 2.2.3. So there's no real difference between what Mr. Herriot said and what and our position on that in terms of its overall impact.
That's grand. Thank you for the clarification. Mr. Kelly, I was just like to come to your statement for a quick moment. I see you have your hand there, so I do have a specific question for you there. On page 5, you do outline the changes in the structure of the document from previous planning policies, highlighting that the low carbon place has been removed, suggesting that the inclusion of renewables within a wider heading of sustainable places suggests such developments now no higher than biodiversity issues and the need to respond to the nature crisis. Would you like to add anything on this point specifically, or do you want to respond to the submissions of the other parties with regard to policy 1?
I think in answer to your question, sir, the text of policy 1 and the associated text doesn't give differential weight to these two pillars. So I assume the two pillars are equal in that respect. In considering policy 1, I think it's helpful to look at the Chief Planner's letter that came out yesterday. Obviously, as Mr. Herriot said, policy 1 is an overarching policy. So in terms of looking at the detail, policy 2 follows on, addressing climate mitigation and adaptation. And in there, notwithstanding the language around global climate emergency, etc., it appears that what we're coming down to is greenhouse gas emissions, trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, currently, electricity generation in Scotland is virtually totally decarbonised. There's only Peterhead reducing greenhouse gas emissions in terms of the power. So, in that regard, I can't see how another wind farm can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because there's virtually no greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generation in Scotland just now anyway. So I think the Chief Planner's letter is very helpful in terms of her commentary on policy 2, in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation. And a bit like the biodiversity thing we'll consider later, she stresses that there is no single accepted methodology for calculating and or minimising emissions. No, I don't think that factor can now carry great weight in your analysis. And the chief planner basically accepts that. That was all I wanted to say, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to go back to the to parties to just respond to that. I'll start with the applicant. Is there anything specifically you'd like to say there to points raised?
Yes, I think specifically in relation to policy 2, Mr. Kelly's comments, I don't think that's a policy that's of relevance to this proposal. To stretch, it may be adapted. If you look at the policy outcomes, it says that emissions from development are minimised and are placed on more resilient to impacts of climate change. So I would take issue with the relevance of that. I think we've got much more relevant policies in policies 1, 3, 4, 5, 7, and 11, for example. Other issues regarding renewable energy generation, no doubt will come on touched upon that, perhaps in terms of the onshore wind policy statement, for example. But just to go back to Mr. Kelly's point, where we do agree, I think, on the equal footing, shall we say, that renewable energy and the climate crisis have now got through policy 1. I would phrase it slightly differently the way that Mr. Kelly has done in paragraph 11 of his hearing statement, where he says it ranks no higher than biodiversity issues. I don't think that's an intention to give renewable energy developments less weight in the planning balance. I think what we've now got is biodiversity coming up the agenda so that it is on an equal footing. So tackling the climate emergency and the nature crisis are on an equal footing. And in that respect, there's a shift, I suppose, from SPP and NPF3 in as much as biodiversity is up the agenda, but by no means has renewable energy gone down the agenda.
Thank you very much. Before I come back to yourself, Mr. Kelly, I'm just going to check with the council if they have any comments on these matters that have been raised.
Thank you, sir. No, I would tend to agree with everything Mr. Herriot has said.
Okay. Mr. Kelly, have you anything more to add at this stage?
Nothing further to add, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So in terms of my specific questions, yeah, I don't have any more specific questions on policy 1, but I would like to give an opportunity for parties to just, if there's anything in particular that isn't set out within their statement that that gives the position counter to that of the other party, and this is an opportunity for you to just raise that. So taking into consideration what the council and the other people have said that we haven't already touched on, do the applicant have anything else to say on policy 1 at this stage?
Yes, sir. Just very briefly, and referring to the chief planner's letter from yesterday, you may find it of some use in coming to a view on the application of policy 1. It says that it should be applied with all other policies of NPF4, and it's for the decision maker to determine whether the significant weight that you must now apply tips the balance either for or against the development. So that may be of some use in coming to your conclusion, but it very clearly tells us that it could potentially be decisive. And in our view, that is a material shift from what we have in SPP and NPF4. Sorry, NPF3.
And the council.
I think that we agree again with much of what Mr. Herriot said there, but there's no doubt that applying SPP and NPF3, the weight to be applied to renewable energy development and other similar factors could be decisive. So, to that point, nothing further to add.
And I'll just give one last opportunity for Mr. Kelly and Mr. Gordon if you have anything to add at this stage.
Nothing further, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this marks the end of policy 1, as I say. So we'd now like to look at policy 3, which focuses on biodiversity. Now, Part 3B states that proposals will only be supported where they will conserve, restore and enhance biodiversity, so that they're in demonstrably better state than without intervention. We received further information through the inquiry process on ornithology and peat, and we're consequently familiar with the position of parties and the points of disagreement with regard to these matters, so we don't need to go back into those at this time. There are a couple of questions that I have. Paragraphs 15 and 16, again, of Mr. Kelly's statement, reference the submission of NatureScot dated the 12th of January. For those that don't have that open at the moment, that's CD 16.29. We're of course aware of the content of this letter, and we note the response of the applicant at pages 34 and 35 of their hearing statement, which is then expanded upon within Appendix 1 of the hearing statement. But in the first instance, we'd welcome the view of the applicant with regard to the suggestion at paragraph 16 of Mr. Kelly's statement that ministers aren't in a position at this time to determine the application, as there's no evidential basis for compliance with policy 3B.
Yes, thank you, sir. Perhaps no surprise that we would disagree with that statement. Yes, it is a new policy we will have to deal with going forward. The Glendye proposal, as many other proposals currently in the planning system, renewable energy or not, were conceived before this policy came about. But what I think you've got in front of you is an application which probably best addresses and the requirements of policy 3B, perhaps more than many other proposals. And that was the intention behind Appendix 1 to our most recent hearing statement, to show how the Glendye proposal and the various enhancement measures align with NPF4, the biodiversity strategy and the energy strategy. And the Chief Planner's letter, again from yesterday, does confirm, and we all recognise that there's no metric yet within Scotland to measure pre and post enhancement measures. But obviously research is being undertaken on that, and we're going to hopefully expect some guidance on that in due course. But I think you can take comfort from the fact that built into the draft management plans and the people and habitat management plans, there's a provision for working groups, steering groups to monitor on a regular basis the works undertaken, the success or otherwise of those, and to convene and perhaps put forward alternative measures to make sure that the intentions are actually being delivered on the ground. And I think also you can take comfort from NatureScot's consultation response, and that is the document from September 2020, CD 5.1. And in that response, NatureScot withdrew an earlier objection to the proposal. And very briefly, they noted that the enhancement measures, and I emphasise enhancement measures, put forward by the applicant would mitigate the loss of peatland habitats, and the scale of restoration proposed is of the extent that it would have wider biodiversity benefits beyond just that of restoring the function of the degraded peatland habitats. So I think things will evolve as we get more guidance in due course, but I don't think the absence of a metric at this point in time in any way would provide a justification for pausing the decision on the application.
I think NatureScot's January that.
Sorry, do you have something to add, Mr. Chair?
If you bear with me a moment, sir. Yeah.
And I suppose aligned with that, in referring to the September 2020 NatureScot letter, we've got the NatureScot letter from January of this year, which we've commented upon in our hearing statement, which ultimately I think we expressed disappointment with that, bearing in mind the nature of previous responses from NatureScot, saying that the extent to which enhancement measures would deliver significant biodiversity benefits, and their response on policy 3. I suppose in many ways felt ignored maybe what was in front of them and the role they had played in reviewing and then commenting upon the enhancement measures put forward by the applicant. So I think that's a key point to bear in mind with their position. But the real one in terms of Mr. Kelly's position, I think, is the September 2020 submission 5.1.
I think just to add to that, yes, we are very disappointed by that January letter from Nature Scott, given what they said before. Simply say we're not aware of any development proposal currently under consideration which addresses this new requirement to enhance biodiversity. There seems to be no joined up thinking on this point at all, given what they said earlier. Glendye is a showcase proposal in terms of NPF policy 3. It's anticipated that policy very well. It delivers on that policy. And the conditions which we've offered enable enough flexibility to respond to the new metric when it comes forward. So yes, disappointment in that.
Thank you very much. Notwithstanding the standing objections to the proposal, we also did note from the withdrawal their objection with regards to ornithology that it was stated that there was conservation there as well. So we are familiar with the position. Can I just ask you there, Mr. Trunick, that your camera seems to have lost you. Is it possible to just rearm that? Thank you very much. So do you have anything further to add at this stage, Mr. Kelly, either in response to the applicant or following the issue of the Chief Planner's correspondence earlier this week?
There's a couple of things. I mean, notwithstanding the applicant's disappointment, the email that Nature Scott sent to you when they indicated they would not take part in this session was quite precise, that no development was tackling this. And I think that ties in with what the Chief Planner says in her commentary on Policy 3. I mean, we all recognise the history of the application and what is being posed, but given that biodiversity is one of the two key pillars of NPF4, I think it elevates the question. And if we deal with it in short, there is a need for a single metric, because what you and ministers are being asked to add up in terms of biodiversity is how do you balance the threat to raptors with habitat enhancement? If you add a negative and a positive together, do you end up with biodiversity enhancement or a loss of biodiversity? Now, the challenge, I think, for decision makers and why this research and further guidance is needed is that the policy is expressed in singular terms, biodiversity. It doesn't distinguish habitats, flora, fauna, or whatever. It's just this single concept of biodiversity. So I still think it represents a very significant challenge for decision makers. And I feel, irrespective of which side the decision eventually falls on, that decision does need to see the outcome of the commissioned research and any subsequent guidance that comes from that research. And I say that without any prejudice as to what that decision would be. You need to see the research and the subsequent guidance. As I say, really, I set that out in the email, and there's really not much more to add today to that, unless you had a specific question, sir. Thank you.
So before I go on to the council, can I go back to the applicant there, Mr. Trent?
Thank you, sir. Yes, I think Mr. Kelly is fundamentally wrong. But I'll make 2 points. First of all, we have a 20 gigawatt by 2030 target. If we start putting off decisions to await some other report or to wait for something to be finalised and perfected, that will certainly prejudice the attainment of that target. That is vital. Secondly, yes, there are uncertainties, but that is why the planning condition offered contains enough flexibility to enable the finalised habitat management proposals and species protection proposals to respond to what comes forward in the finalised Scottish biodiversity strategy and the metric which accompanies it. So wholly reject what Mr. Kelly says.
Thank you very much.
I just make one very brief point, and I appreciate Mr. Kelly's comments in relation to this particular application, saying that this should be assisted in appending this guidance. If we follow that logic through, all applications, major national EIA development, should also be assisted pending this guidance. And I certainly don't think that's in anyone's interest. I don't know how many such applications are either live, pending, or being prepared, but I can imagine it would run into perhaps some, maybe 100 or something like that. And we've got a national development here, as Mr. Trinick says, so I don't think that following that logic through would be to anyone's benefit.
Thank you very much. So can I go to the council there to see if you have any comments to make specifically on this matter?
Yes. So first of all, can I make it clear that I'm not representing Nature Scott today? That said, you probably won't remember, but in paragraph 65 of the council's closing submissions, they referred to and endorsed Nature Scott's submission on the need for a legal agreement in respect to peatland mitigation. And our understanding of that endorsement was that Nature Scott were content that adequate mitigation had been provided. Now, Mr. Herriot and others have mentioned the words enhancement. But if you look at CD 5.1, page 2 at the bottom of the page, it's very clear the way in which Nature Scott used that word enhancement. They say we advise that proposed enhancement measures will mitigate for the loss of peatland habitats. So you can't just take enhancement out of context. Nature Scott's position is Nature Scott's position. There is no metric that's confirmed by the Chief Planner's letter. Aberdeenshire Council's position, apologies for that slip of the tongue, is set out in paragraphs 2.2.7 to 8, and that position is maintained.
Or just my scribble in here, I'm just taking those references down. Thank you very much. Do any other parties, by show of hands, wish to comment specifically on this point, or can we move a little further into this policy? Mr. Trinick.
Sorry to come back on that. We've noted Aberdeenshire Council's paragraph 228. I note that Aberdeenshire Council offered not a shred of evidence on ornithological impacts, and yet manages to conclude in a statement authored by Aberdeenshire Council and not Nature Scott that we've not avoided impacts. I'm not sure how it reaches that conclusion, but we know that Nature Scott withdrew its objection on ornithological grounds. We also know that there's a proposed regional eagle management plan which has been put forward. In terms of mitigation enhancement, we look at policy 3B3 and we say that we have fully mitigated in line with the mitigation hierarchy. We have avoided, then we've minimised, then we've mitigated, and then through the habitat management proposals and the regional eagle plan, we have enhanced. We offer the enhancements. This is not simply mitigation. This is enhancement.
I appreciate the position, the contrasting position here on this point with the outstanding objection and the council's position. And having read through the evidence that's been submitted, I'm comfortable that we're familiar. Is there anything more on this matter? No. Okay, so I'm going to now give opportunity to respond to any of the other points raised in relation to policy 3 within the statements that aren't included with your own submissions, or to point anything specific out that you'd like to raise. And again, we're going to start with the applicant. Is there anything further on policy B you'd like to touch on? On policy 3.
In policy 3, sir. Thank you.
And do the council have anything to add at this point?
No, thank you, sir.
Thank you. And I'll take it that without the show of hands, there's nothing further. It may help if, as I say, there is a raise hand tool at the top. If when we're talking on any specific topic area, Dr. Gordon and Mr. Kelly, if you do wish to add anything at the end of that section, if you just press that tool, then I'll know to come to you. Thank you. So thank you. I believe we now have enough information on this matter, and we're proposing to move to policy 4, natural places. Part D of this policy relates to local landscape designations. We appreciate the council's second reason for objection focuses on the impacts of the proposed development on 2 special landscape areas, and we're familiar with the contrasting positions again of parties with regard to the qualifying interests of the designations. However, we would like to invite the applicant in the first instance to expand upon paragraphs 2.74 and 2.75 of the hearing statement, or anything broader that he believes relevant at this stage, and then we'll go to the council to respond. So I think you've got those statements.
So just finding those paragraphs.
Focusing basically on, I'll let you read it.
Okay, no, found that. That's great. Thank you. Got my bearings. Yes, so the commentary on those 2 paragraphs in the hearing statement relates to the second limb of policy 4D. It's 4D2, and that is engaged if you were to conclude that the first part of policy 4D is not met. And in instances, significant effects might rise upon the SLA integrity. So our position is that we do meet the first test. The second test is related to where those impacts may be outweighed by social, economic, or environmental benefits of at least local importance. And I think there's 2 points here to make. One is that it's an either-or scenario. The policy doesn't require you to have social, economic, and environmental benefits of at least local importance. Is at least one of those 3 strands will do. And therefore it then comes into what is of at least local importance. And I think first and foremost, I think this is where the national development category, national development 3, comes into play in a development management context. The proposed development exceeds 50 megawatts generating capacity and falls within the category of national development 3 and NPF4. And we comment upon that in our hearing statement. And I think that for those national developments to have some function and purpose in a development management context, I think this is actually quite a good case in point that where a decision maker may well be balancing effects against issues of importance, you've got here a defined national development because of its renewable energy generating capacity. So we would argue that the environmental benefits on the generation side alone tick the environmental box and it's at least local importance. And in tandem with that, we have got what we describe as other environmental benefits and enhancements relating to peatland restoration. And I think it's important just to reiterate here the scale of peatland restoration that's being looked at of at least 450 hectares. So it's a sizable area alongside other issues such as the Regional Eagle Conservation Management Plan. There's 11.5 kilometres of riparian planting proposed as well. So individually and collectively, we feel that these benefits of the project really do demonstrate they are of at least local importance. And if you need to engage the second part of policy 4D, we do believe that we meet the test and that those benefits do outweigh what we would describe as a localised effect. Clearly outweigh, yeah. That's the testing policy.
Thank you very much. So again, taking aside the contrasting views on whether part one of the policies met, would the council like to respond to those points that have been made?
I think it's fair to say that benefits of renewable energy schemes do have benefits of at least local importance. You know, it is a national development, and it does, you know, go some way towards addressing the global crisis. But you know, given the increased protection of the SLAs and the aim of the policy to protect natural assets, including landscapes, the adverse impacts need to be clearly outweighed by the benefits.
And the use of the word clearly outweighed is not a normal balancing exercise. It's akin to a tilted balancing exercise that I think was contained in paragraph 33 of SPP, or still contained in paragraph 33 of SPP until Monday. But paragraph 4A has a normal balancing exercise. Paragraph 4D has a tilted balancing exercise. Tilted balance has a connotation which may not be free from dispute, but the use of the word clearly outweighed is there to import something additional, and it's that which gives, as well as the D as a whole, the additional protection for SLAs.
Mr. Trinick?
I'm not sure I agree with what Mr. Finlay says there. The tilted balance is phrased in terms of significantly and demonstrably outweigh. This is simply clearly outweigh. And to me, the alternative to clearly is not very clearly. I'm not sure that it adds very much. Visibly, you can make a case that it outweighs. I don't see the point of emphasis that Mr. Finlay sees, I'm afraid.
So do any other parties have anything to add with regards to policy 4D at this time? Okay.
Just brief.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Sorry, sir. I was just briefly to direct you back to CD 5.1 and the Nature Scot response, which I think could be useful in your deliberations on whether or not these benefits have been clearly outweighed. And that's where we refer to the enhancement measures, biodiversity benefits going beyond just that ecosystem peak and function. I think that does help the case on the enhancement measure alone, alongside which we've got the renewable energy generation benefits.
So if we could just respond to that briefly. Obviously, when you take those benefits into account, you have to take disbenefits of the impact on peat that without which are directly and the road building and the like, which are direct impacts of the development. So I'm not suggesting that Mr. Herriot is wrong that they should be taken into account. There's a much bigger balancing exercise if you bring those into account. I accept his point that it's social, environmental, or economic, and I think Ms. Tully has made it quite clear that we accept as it's a national development. They clearly passed the economic test and the environmental test in terms of contribution to renewable energy. I'm not wishing to it could cover both of those. So I don't think there's a dispute that as to the local importance, it's whether they're clearly outweighed and whether D1 applies.
So I'm sorry I don't want to prolong this, but I say again, the position on peat, we have followed the mitigation hierarchy. It isn't a question of balancing the enhancements against the losses. We have mitigated and then we have enhanced. That is the case we made, and that's set out in the hearing statement.
Mr. Trinick is rehearsing his case again. We dispute that. We say there's a mitigation. That's the position that Council and Nature Scot adopted. That will be a matter for your judgment. I'm not going to rehearse our case on either side of that. We don't accept the exemplar project. point that he made earlier.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your the exchange there. That's going to be very helpful. Does the applicant wish to respond to any other matters raised regarding policy 4 within the submissions?
No, sir, I've covered everything off. Thank you.
And the council? I think you're on mute there, sorry.
Hoping the nodding of the head would get through, but no, it's the answer.
Okay, thanks. Unfortunately, with my screen, you're quite small, so it's difficult to, unless you are quite frenzied in your waving, it's going to be difficult to read you, I'm afraid. Okay, so thank you very much for that. We're going to move on to policy 11. Oh, sorry, Ms. Hayward.
But I just suggest, I think policy 11 is going to be quite a long topic. Can I just suggest that we have the break at this point?
Yeah, yeah. Policy 11 is certainly the where the most of our questions lie. So if people are happy with that, I would suggest that we take a quick break and come back at 10:30. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that's everybody back. Just checking. Yes, that would appear everybody's back. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay, thank you. Before we go on to policy 11, we've just been made aware that an additional hearing statement was submitted by Commander Strawn in advance of this session. Now, we've not had sight of that, and it would appear that other participants haven't had sight either. So what we would suggest, rather than introduce an additional party at this time, which we can't really accept, given that there's been no sworn from all participants as to the what's included in that statement. What we'd suggest is that we'll take that statement and we will circulate it to participants, and people will be given a week to respond to points raised within there, and we'll take that fully into consideration in our assessment and in our report drafting. Would participants be open to that as an approach? Thank you. Thank you very much. Moving on then to policy 11, which focuses on energy. Sorry, Ms. Haywood.
Just pointing out that Mr. Gordon wants to say something.
Oh, sorry. I see you there, yeah.
Sorry, sir, I just want to clarify the timing of that, because I'm away the whole of the second half of February. So would it be circulated prior to that?
We'll have it circulated at the close of this meeting.
That's fine, thank you, sir.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, and apologies there for this being introduced this time. So policy 11 looks specifically at energy, and in this section of the agenda, we'd like to hear the views of parties, in particular regarding a couple of matters. Firstly, Part E2 of the policy suggests that localised landscape and visual impacts would generally be considered acceptable. We'd like to start by seeking the views of parties regarding the term localised in the first instance on its relevance to the proposal. Could we start with the applicant on this, please?
Yes, thank you, sir. So our view on this is that the landscape and visual effects associated with this particular wind farm are localised in the context of this policy. We've heard evidence on that in the inquiry session set out in Ms. Oakley's inquiry report, and again touched upon in my hearing statement. And our view is that the choice of the site location within a bowl has the effect of limiting theoretical visibility quite significantly in this instance, and probably to a much more localized extent that you might otherwise expect for a commercial wind farm of this scale, for example. And I suppose the whole issue of what we mean by localized is going to come down to individual sites and be on a case-by-case basis. But I think a possible barometer, we obviously set out our views on this particular site, but a possible other barometer might be to consider the spread of landscape and visual effects relative to another scheme of a similar scale, for example. Is it akin to that, or would the spread of landscape and visual effects be tighter than that? Would they be more localized, or would they go beyond what you might reasonably expect for landscape and visual effects? And our view is that in this instance, the effects are localized, and we do have this particular geographical feature which we believe helps contain the visual effects.
Thank you. Is there anything more, Mr. Trinick, or would you like me, or am I able to go across to the council for their response on that?
Happy for you to go to the council.
Thank you. So would the council like to respond directly to that, or to add anything themselves about their own interpretation of how localised should be considered relevant?
Yeah, thank you, sir. I would agree with Mr. Herriot that localised impact comes down to an individual's individual development characteristics, but I would point you to 2.2.14 of my hearing statement, and that just basically says that the evidence given by Mr. Steele and Ms. Fletcher in the August sessions considers that the impacts do go beyond localised, and I would just note that there's no definition as to what localised is. It just does come down to individual characteristics.
And if we could add to that, the concept of effects being localised and if being localised are generally acceptable is not a new one. It's a new one in guidance. So to that extent, the guidance is new and says something different, but it's one that has been familiar to various reporters and in a number of reports. The fact that effects are localised or generally localised is a matter that a number of reporters in a number of decisions, including in Aberdeenshire, have taken into account. I don't think it's necessary to refer you to particular reports, but I can do if need be. But I'm sure you and Say would be familiar with those. So it's another indication where the authors of NPF4 have put into guidance practice that has been applied, not invariably in every case before, but it's that. But it, along with localised and appropriate and acceptable, there are judgments to be made in applying it, and there's no indication. I don't think there's any, as been said, Ms. Tully said, there's no indication of what localised is. That will be a matter of judgment. And finally, the concept of more than you would expect from a usual commercial wind farm is again a concept that's been reviewed in other appeal decisions, but it's not just the scale of the wind farm, it's the location. And the parties robustly disagree as to whether this is localised or not. You have Nature Scott saying it has a regional impact, and the applicant saying it has no impact beyond local impact. So that's a matter for you. I won't rehearse that.
The applicant have anything to respond?
Yes, I'll just respond briefly. I think there's a big difference between what may have been practice in various decisions, and not universal practice, but practice on a number of decisions, and something coming into the development plan. Certainly where impacts are localised, they will generally be considered to be acceptable, is something entirely new in guidance, and I think a major departure from anything we've seen before. It's a major change. So it can't be massaged away by references to earlier decisions, somehow leading the drafters of this document to recognise what has always been the case. That's not the case. Secondly, if Mr. Finney says it's about location as well as spatial extent, I think that was what he said, and my apologies if I got it wrong. I disagree with that. It's not about location. Location means spatial framework. And in terms of spatial framework, we're outside the national park or an NSA. It is about, I think, spatial extent. That's what it's referring to, localised.
Is there anything else from the council that to respond?
Just come back to that again. It's a bit like policy one. We accept that the fact that it's in policy is a change, a major change. It's how it's applied in this particular case. And location, what I wasn't meaning spatial strategy, or what I meant by that was that in response to Mr. Herriot's point about what you would normally expect from a wind farm of this scale, what you normally expect from wind farms of a particular scale will depend on their particular location. Their siting might be a better word to use it to avoid confusion with spatial strategy. A different wind at the same size of wind farm and on a different site may give rise to significantly different impacts. Is the point I was seeking to make. But that's all I was to add. Thank you.
Accept that, and thank you.
So, although this was touched upon earlier, we would now like to hear the views of parties on the policy requirement that significant weight be placed on the contribution of the proposal to renewable energy generation targets and greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And again, we'll start with the applicant once more, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. As we said at the outset, in our view, this is where NPF4 does mark a radical change from its predecessor documents. The Minister, in his speech to Parliament, described NPF4 as a turning point, not a general policy update. And I think that should be borne in mind. I think also bring you back to the policy outcome here of Policy 11, which is the expansion of renewable, low carbon and zero emission technologies. So that's the outcome. Policy E sets out the list of criteria that you need to assess in considering proposals, which is very similar to what we have in SPP 169. But again, where we feel it differs and significantly so is the last the penultimate paragraph in Part E, where it says, in considering these impacts. So once you have been through items E1 through to 12, and you're considering that balance, you must give significant weight to the contribution that the proposal makes to the renewable energy generation targets and greenhouse gas emission targets. So you may find, for example, that there are significant landscape and visual effects and that they might not be localised. That's not the end of the story. You've got to consider all the other criteria and then place significant weight in terms of Policy 11 on the renewable energy generation benefits, which we claim we do contribute to quite significantly, and also Policy 1, which mentions the contributions to the nature crisis, which Policy 11 doesn't. And that's where we see a significant difference and a direct shift and indeed a turning point.
So just to add to that I think the way I read E is that where it says project design and mitigation will demonstrate, I think that's a duty on the developer to demonstrate, and I'm putting my own meaning on this now, that he has given proper attention to the following matters. It doesn't mean resolve them, doesn't mean rendered them satisfactory or eliminated them, doesn't mean not made them not significant, it means properly addressed, given proper attention to. Then the decision maker comes in at the end of the list of 13 factors and considers the impacts, and in doing so gives significant weight as it states. Thank you, sir.
Just take this before I go to the council.
Ms. Tully will go first.
Ms. Tully.
Thank you, Sir. 2.2.16 of my hearing statement, it's accepted that significant weight is definitely the main change in this policy, but overall it's not a fundamental change in approach. The significant weight has been given to climate change for a while by decision makers, and some examples are included in a footnote on page 8 of that hearing statement.
I add 2 points to that. Secondly, respectfully agree with Mr. Trinick that E they didn't quite put it this way, it's not a test. It's broadly, and I made the submission yesterday, equivalent to the Electricity Act, which requires various things to be taken into account. But I think parties now agree that doesn't provide a test. The applicant will be expected to have addressed those issues. What you then do with those issues is a further step, and as part of that further step, you will apply significant weight to the benefits. In our submission, that they will all feed into what might be considered to be the overall approach under policy 4A is deciding whether the development's acceptable or unacceptable. So it's not a development test. Policy 11 doesn't include a development test. It provides, broadly similarly to current SPP and NPF4, a series of factors that need to be taken into account, leaving the judgment as to what's acceptable or otherwise to the decision maker. And if you look at the I think it's the explanatory report to NPF4 otherwise, some parties did ask for guidance as to what was acceptable or unacceptable. And the response to that was that factors are given, but there's no express guidance as to that. And so to that extent, I agree with Mr. Trinick. The only point of dispute I'd raise is to raise a general point of concern that when you are asked to apply headline statements such as Mr. Herriot did about the biggest change since 1947 or the it's not just a update, you have to be very careful about applying the general to the particular in any specific instance, because there are some policies, and this document goes far wider than renewable energy, that are new, very new. Some take matters forward, some reflect existing approach. It's just a general word of caution.
The applicant, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, thank you, sir. Absolutely, I agree with Mr. Finlay that NPF4 does go further than renewable energy, that there's no question about that. But at the risk of repeating myself, we have got these twin pillars of the climate emergency and the nature crisis. Not my words, the Minister's words, and at the forefront of the NPF4. And I also think it's very important to bring it back to outcomes. We can discuss the minutiae of policy over and over, but bring it back to outcomes. And I've already touched upon the outcomes of policy 11, expansion of renewable low carbon technologies. You've also got the outcomes of NPF4 as a whole, set by statute and summarised in page 95. 6 outcomes, including contribution to housing needs, health and wellbeing, population of rural areas. The last 2, which I think are particularly pertinent in this case, meeting any targets relating to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and securing positive benefits for biodiversity. Of those 6 out of the 6 are relevant. We think we got ticks in both boxes. There's still a balancing act to be applied. Absolutely, we're not suggesting anything other than that. But we do believe that NPF4, through policy 1 and policy 11 in particular, do shift the emphasis in that final consideration.
I need just to see that I note the contribution to outcomes. That's obviously relevant. We potentially disagree about the last bullet point. Our position is clear, I hope, as to the extent to which, in terms of renewable energy, there is any real difference is the extent of weight to be attached to meeting the targets. I won't rehearse our case on that.
Okay, so moving on, Mr. Kelly, within paragraph 13 of your statement, your finding is that the overall importance of onshore wind is lesser in NPF than in prior policy, and that consequently the need for additional onshore wind farms has significantly less priority than before. Given the submissions of the other parties, would you like to highlight anything specifically within the document to help us better appreciate this position before we go on to the other parties to respond?
Just deal with that very simply, sir. The title of the policy is energy, not onshore wind energy. It's a much broader approach to energy than previous policy, focusing very much on onshore wind. And I read the whole policy as being one that is no longer specifically and only directed at wind farms. And that's the simple approach I take to it, sir.
And is there any response to this from
I don't think so, sir. Thank you.
council? So thank you very much. That's the end of specific questions, but we'll now give the opportunity to respond in turn to any given points raised within the submissions relevant to policy 11. And I'd just like to start with the applicant once more.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I've got a few observations to make on the council's comments on policy 11, being paragraphs 2.213 and 2.217, a hearing statement, some of which Miss Tully's touched upon already. In paragraph 2.214, we've already discussed this, but we've got this comment in there about localised landscape impact generally being considered to be acceptable. And the final sentence there says that in the council's view, this does not introduce a new approach in the planning assessment. And it is true that decision makers will have had to consider localised versus widespread, acceptable or not. But what we now have for the first time in policy, actually not guidance, is the statement that localised effects will generally be considered acceptable. My view on that is it would be unusual for these effects not to be considered acceptable. So I would take slight disagreement with the final wording of 2214. In 2215, again, Ms. Tully touched upon this, that the significant change in approach to policy 11 and the importance to the greenhouse gas emissions. I take issue there with the parallel between what the policy says in giving significant weight to these issues and the comment in the Statement of Agreed Matters. The Statement of Agreed Matters simply said that renewable energy policy related statutory targets are matters that should be afforded weight in the planning balance. What we now have is national planning policy telling us not just weight, significant weight. So I think that parallel doesn't really go anywhere for me. And in 2216, I would agree entirely with what they say in the second sentence, that the main change, policy 11, is the direction for decision makers place significant weight on these key issues. But I would entirely disagree with the final sentence where it says that there's not a fundamental change. We've rehearsed that. I'll not revisit it in detail, but that's our position on that point. And in 2217, there's a comment there about whether or not significant weight can be decisive weight. Well, it could be, and we have the comment to that very effect from the chief planner in his letter yesterday, saying that the significant weight should put the balance one way or the other. And I suppose if you're giving significant weight to one issue, that might mean you're giving less weight to another issue. Doesn't mean, for example, that landscape is of less importance than what it was pre-NPF4, but the climate emergency and the nature crisis are of more importance. And that's all a relative weight issue in the final planning balance. And those are all the comments, sir. Thank you.
Would the council like to respond or add anything in particular regarding questions of the applicant?
Yeah, really, we've made our position, I hope, clear. I just wanted to respond to that last point, Mr. Herriot, which perhaps touches on the point he made about the Statement of Agreed Matters. The dispute between the applicant and the council as to weight has not been about the weight to be afforded to the renewable energy benefits. It's whether less weight should be given to the adverse impacts on the environment. And the council's position was and remains that there is nothing in the document which justifies giving less weight to adverse impact on the environment, which is a matter that we may come to in your last bullet point under this section.
So before we go on to the last bullet point and we'll look at other matters and balance and whatnot, is there anything additional on policy 11 specifically?
I think so.
Okay, so we'd now like to discuss what can be taken from policy 11 or elsewhere in NPF4 about how these considerations should be balanced with each other or with the overall need for renewable development. Before we do that, are there any other specific policy areas referred to within the hearing statements that parties would like to respond to?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
If I may, sir, yes, just very briefly, just to touch upon policy 5. We do make submissions on that in our hearing statement, and I'd just like to highlight that policy. I think it is relevant in the context of the applicant's environmental enhancement measures and particularly peatland restoration. And I'd just like to briefly draw your attention to that policy and the policy intent and the policy outcomes, which we feel we very much align with through the significant peatland restoration, as I alluded to earlier, over an area of at least 450 hectares. And renewable energy developments are identified in that policy as potentially acceptable uses on peatland areas, for example. So it aligns with our argument on the environmental enhancements and our arguments on policy 3. And really, we feel we do deliver on the policy intent and the policy outcomes. So that was the only other one I wanted to highlight.
We all the policies referenced within the statements we will be fully taking into consideration. It was just where there was specific disagreements we were going to focus today. Is there anything that the council would like to say about that, about the policy 5 and that comment there?
Only that I don't want to rehearse the differences between us on mitigation or enhancement. You have that. I agree that policy 5C2 is a change from before, that renewable energy, the generation of renewable energy that optimises the contribution to greenhouse gas emission reduction targets is now contemplated on peatland, which is a significant change from the identification of that in Group 2 under the current SPP. It's a good example of where the Scottish ministers wish to make a significant change. They have made it expressly.
Thank you very much. So moving on to balance, we'd like to hear how parties understand policies within NPF4 will be balanced against one another and against the twin crises of climate and nature, taking into consideration Part 3 of the document and the annexes. And also, of course, we had the timely letter yesterday by the Chief Planner. So on this matter, we'll start the applicant.
Thank you, sir. I think one point on which all parties are probably aligned is that NPF4 should be read as a whole. Obviously, we're focusing upon half a dozen policies here, but the document itself says on page 98 it should be read as a whole. And that is, again, as you mentioned, alluded to yesterday in the Chief Planner's letter. With specific regard to the question about the balance and how they're tallied up with each other, I think the Chief Planner's letter does refer also to policy conflicts may arise, for example. And in terms of applying weight, the Chief Planner makes the point under his comments on applying, under the subheading of applying NPF4, he refers to the need to have regard to the intent and the outcomes of the policies, and states that this will guide decision making. And I've mentioned that at several points, but I think yesterday's letter from the Chief Planners does really add emphasis to that. Is a change in NPF4. We don't have that in SPP or NPF3. And when they come to do this balance, go back to the most relevant policies. I think also we have to really bring in the National Development 3 as well. in considering the balance. We've touched upon that previously. This proposal does benefit from National Development 3 status, and the language in NPF4 about National Development 3 and the need for it, I think, is pertinent here. It talks about the need for a large and rapid increase in renewable electricity to meet targets, and describes this type and this scale of development as being fundamental to achieving a net zero economy. And slightly going off piece, maybe onto the onshore wind policy statement, but there's a statement in there that I think is pertinent in considering the policy arguments, and that's paragraph 3.6.2. And there the onshore wind policy statement is describing the changes made to NPF4 and the renewable energy assessment criteria, mentioning that stronger weight should be given to the renewable energy benefits of a project. So I think we have a lot in NPF4. And the outcomes set by law, outcomes for individual policies, and also in the national development that helps guide and provide that balance in the final decision-making process.
In council.
Yes, there's nothing that what Mr. Herriot said that we disagree with, but it's one side of the balance. There are various other parts of NPF4 and indeed the OWPS which may be of assistance to you. First, on page 7, under the National Spatial Strategy, not only the first paragraph in the left-hand column in bold, but the second paragraph, which says meeting our climate ambition will require a rapid transformation across all sectors of our economy and society. This means ensuring the right development happens in the right place. And that's a concept that was that's well hallowed. I know Mr. Trinick is not necessarily enamoured with it, but in our submission, it is its repetition in this document and in the OWPS in paragraph 3.6.1 is an indication that of a similar balancing act that was undertaken previously. So in the bold above, one sees the words protecting, recovering and restoring our environment, which will not only include flora and fauna, but will include the natural environment. And that is made clear if you go to page 8 under the cross-cutting outcome and policy links. The roles of policies 3 and 4 are to protect biodiversity and natural assets. And that perhaps comes as no surprise. Again, if you go to page 18, under rural revitalisation, at the bottom of the page, there's a recognition of environmental quality as a key asset for rural areas. And again, policies 3, 4, 5 and 6 are referenced. There's nothing particularly outstanding about these references. They're nothing new, but it's presenting a more balanced picture. And I'd say by way of reference to, there's no change indicated in the general protection to the environment. Where there is change, and we just highlighted one, which was peat, development on peat, and another noticeable one is development on the edges of wild land. If you look at the last subsection of policy 4, there's a direct indication that impacts of wind farm developments outside wildland areas will not be considered significant. So where the Scottish ministers wish to make a change, it is telegraphed and expressed. Otherwise, there are those references. And if I could, like Mr. Herriot, briefly turn to the OWPS, you have our submissions on that, and we'll come to them in due course. I mentioned the right development in the right place at 3.6.1, but again, just trying to find something to assist with the balancing exercise. Annex 5 to the document is about the vision for onshore wind, and in the by form of a joint statement or statement of common ground, the third bullet point under the executive summary talks about the need to respect biodiversity and natural heritage, and that word respect is picked up again at the bottom of page 8 and 9, top of page 9, and also on page 8, it makes it clear that we should be maximising the use of exceptional natural wind resources where environmental effects are acceptable. So that doesn't add a policy test, but in terms of assisting you and how the overall balance should be undertaken, in our submission, those reinforce the basic thrust of Aberdeenshire Council's case, that the environment is still valued and protected in a general sense, and the balancing exercise is as set out in Ms. Tully's statement.
Mr. Turner?
So yes, Mr. Finlay knows he can always wind me up nicely with talking about the right development in the right place. I won't go on too much about it, but he always does it very successfully. Policy 4A in NPF4 and phrases such as the right development in the right place are no more than a statement that there is a planning balance. They say no more than that. It's how you apply the balance that matters. But I must acknowledge also at the same time that NPF4 gives the nature crisis equal billing with the climate crisis. It elevates the importance of the nature crisis, and that has to be taken into account. In terms of the application of the balance, I'm afraid I feel that if you're going to give more weight, if you visualize it as a balance, if you give more weight to one side of the balance, then uncomfortable though it is, you do give less weight to the other side of the balance. That is inescapable logic. And that is my view. In terms of express change, I acknowledge what Mr. Finlay says, but apart from looking for express change, you have to look also at the entire flavour of the document. Look at the ministerial statement. NPF4, the whole flavour of it, is quite different from SPP, and I think you have to read the flavour as well as express changes such as that relating to the wild land. So probably do disagree with what Mr. Finlay says there. I think in terms of the balance, something has changed here and needs to be recognised. Thank you.
Any final comments on balance, Council?
Can I just come back to that briefly? The apologies to Mr. Trinick for winding him up, but the reference to 4A and right development in the right place are perhaps good indications that that NPF4 isn't wholly new. There are some concepts taken forward from before, some are new, and that's a good example. The value of them we'll leave to another debate. The more weight point is an interesting one. If significant weight was given to, in practice, to renewable energy benefits before taking that concept broadly, and we're now told to give significant weight to it afterwards, there is no change. And lastly, as to the thrust of the document, if Scottish ministers had intended there to be a significant change to the overall balancing exercise, in our submission, it would be very surprising if they left that to be inferred from the document rather than stated it expressly.
Can I just check in terms of balance? I noticed there are no additional hands up. People happy at this stage? Yeah. So that brings us to the end of our questions actually regarding NPF4. I just want to check that everybody's satisfied to rest on the statements and the discussion we've just had before we look at the next section in the agenda. It's only been 40 minutes since our last break, so I'd suggest that we could probably, given my notes and my questions, I'd imagine that these subsequent sections are going to go much faster. So I'd suggest that we do just press on slightly at this point, unless anybody. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll continue here to the updated local development plan. So at the time of the previous policy session, the LDP examination report had already been issued, and the emerging LDP was considered alongside the outgoing plan. So rather than us focus on the LDP policies, this section of the agenda will just allow parties to highlight any perceived incompatibilities between the most relevant policies of NPF4, of the plan and NPF4, before we discuss how such incompatibilities should be addressed. And again, this week's letter from the Chief Planner is going to be helpful in this regard. Firstly, I'm going to ask if there are any specific policies the party would like us to focus upon. I'll start with the applicant.
Yes, excuse me, thank you, sir. So two policies probably worth highlighting to you, and that is the relationship of policy LDPC 2.2 with NPF4 policy 11 and LDP policy HE 1.5 and policy 7H as it relates to cultural heritage and scheduled monuments. The main differences, and I'll leave Mr. Trinick to discuss whether there's incompatibility in terms of the Act, but the main differences I see between these policies is in relation to policy C2.2. There's broad alignment there, I would suggest, between the renewable energy assessment criteria in that policy and what we have in policy 11. Where we've got a change now is in relation to the spatial framework. In relation to policy C2.2 is accompanied by a spatial framework mapping based upon the old SPP Group 1, 2 and Group 3 areas. We no longer have the spatial framework for onshore wind in the NPF4, as we've made clear in our hearing statement, and that's where I see the difference there, being a key difference in terms of the locational acceptability, if you want to put it that way. Policy 11 makes it clear that onshore wind farms and other forms of renewable energy development are acceptable in principle, except for national parks and national scenic areas. And that includes, for example, SLAs where we're situated just here. Obviously, there's policy 4, but we no longer have the spatial framework. So that's the key change in terms of those policies. And then policy 7H that deals with cultural heritage and setting of scheduled monuments. I noted in my hearing statement a difference there in the wording, where we now have in policy 7H part 2, where we're considering the effect of a development upon the of scheduled monument. The test is now whether there's significant adverse impacts on the integrity of the setting. And we compare that, as I do in my hearing statement, with SPP 145 and the LDP policy, HE 1.5, refers to adverse impacts on the integrity only. So there's a change in language there. The introduction of significant international policy does bring about a change between current national policy and SPP 145 and what we've got in the HE 1.5 and the LDP.
So it might help to set the scene for the council's response if I did just address what the chief planner has said about incompatibility, because in other words, does it matter whether there is a difference? That we can see in the chief planner's letter that provisions that are contradictory or in conflict will be considered incompatible. That leads me to the sort of formulation that says, well, would the application of NPF4 to the evidence lead to a materially different conclusion than the application of the LDP? If so, then I think section 24 as amended kicks in. But if the difference is just an inconsistency that doesn't lead to a materially different conclusion, then so what? I think it has to matter, not simply an incompatibility that doesn't matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Council.
Can I just have 2 seconds to have a discussion?
No problem.
Just responding first to Mr. Trinick's submission, which is of interest. In terms of the Chief Planner's letter, incompatibility is actual contradiction or conflict. So it's not just difference in phrasing or difference in wording. And I am actually tempted to agree that if it leads to a materially different conclusion, although you're looking at it from the potentially the wrong end of the telescope, that's a good test as to whether something is incompatible or not, because you're looking at the substance of it rather than the specific wording. And to my mind, that's what incompatibility is getting at. You wouldn't expect policies to be worded in entirely the same way in different documents produced at different times. And although I haven't heard it put that way before, in terms I'm reasonably attracted to the materially different conclusion point as an overall litmus test. And having taken that into account, notwithstanding what Mr. Harriott has said, in our view, the policies aren't incompatible. They can be applied compatibly, one with the other, the two that he indicated. And in our submission, there is no materially different outcome that would result from them.
So taking these matters into account, I was going to ask how parties suggest these are addressed, but I think as you say, you've preempted and already advised me on. So
can I just add one point, or ask Ms. Tully to add one point about the spatial map, which is something that hasn't been raised, but was raised yesterday?
Yes. I would just like to highlight that spatial map feature at the end of policy, climate change policy in the LDP. It's the council's current position that it's unlikely it would be used in decision making. It's based on SPP in the group 1, 2 and 3 areas. So, come Monday could be considered out of date. But I would say that, this site was technically a group 2 area, and that's by virtue of the presence of peat. But it is a considered acceptable group 2 area. So, and that was through the mitigation proposed. So the retirement of the map, I would suggest, wouldn't really have too much of an impact on the consideration of the development.
Very much. So are there any other matters that parties would like to raise regarding the updated LDP?
Thanks, sir.
No, thank you.
Okay, so we can swiftly move on to item 4, which is the onshore wind policy statement and the draft energy strategy and just transition plan and associated ministerial statement. So this section of the agenda focuses upon those documents. We're going to work our way through the bullet points listed on the agenda and allow those parties that wish to comment to do so. We'll follow the same order for each bullet, starting with the applicant and then seeking the views from the council. And if Mountaineer in Scotland and Mr. Kelly are minded to that, they can do. We will, of course, take cognizance of your hearing statements. So don't feel we need to cover everything here that we've already written, and just focus on any points of disagreement if possible. So we'll start with the key provisions, ambitions and aspirations of the statement, the onshore wind policy statement, and any differences with the previous refresh document that it supersedes. And again, yes, we'll start with the council. Well, not the council, sorry, the applicant. Apologies.
Thank you, sir. You have my submissions on that in section 4 of the hearing statement. I suppose that the key headline ambitions here are the generation of a minimum installed capacity of 20 megawatts of onshore wind by 2030, which represents a roughly 130% increase from what we've currently got right now, which is a big challenge, and we've only got sort of 8 years to achieve it. And I would note that the targets are minimum levels only. There's certainly incentive schemes that can make a contribution to that, schemes that are in planning that might make a contribution to that, but not all of those pipeline schemes will come forward. And one of the key issues that we feel to recognise is the premium, if you want to put it that way, on schemes that have got a pre-2030 grid connection and therefore can make a contribution to the 2030 targets. And as I set out my hearing statement, Glendye is one such scheme. The ambitions, I think it's really important in the context of what we've just been discussing about the role of onshore wind in meeting wider 2030 and 2045 targets. It's described as mission critical in the conclusions of the onshore wind policy statement. And in the same section, there's an emphasis upon a renewed commitment to the technology, recognising that it'll be deployed at greater volumes over the coming decade. I think what is a noticeable change, and with added emphasis in the document, is the statement that landscapes will change, and that is perhaps an obvious statement to make, and I do allude to that and recognise that in my hearing statement. Nevertheless, it is a statement that has added emphasis in the onshore wind policy statement itself. And that is set within the context in paragraphs 3.61 and 3.62, where there's discussion about giving stronger weight to the renewable energy benefits of a scheme in the planning balance set out in the NPF4 assessment criteria. So those are the key headline targets and headline issues I would pull out from the onshore wind policy statement. You have other submissions in my hearing statement itself. Would you like me to briefly go on and talk about the energy strategy and the just transition plan, or would you like to give other parts?
We'll just take them in turn. So we'll go to the council now, and we'll just tackle each document one after the other. It helps my notes. Thank you.
Mr. Lee will go first, and then I'll add in.
Yeah, we accept that the OWPS 2022 has the ambition of 20 gigawatt of installed capacity by 2030. I just want to say a little bit about the landscape change that was picked up on. Accepting again that to reach the 2030 targets, landscape will change, and the emphasis added on the phrase, this will change the landscape, is significant and it's noteworthy. But I think we still really need to strike a balance between landscape impacts and reaching targets. It's not viewed as a case of development at any cost. It is still, an indication that we, not a case of development at any cost. It's just an indication that we should accept a degree of landscape change.
I was interested in the agenda, the comparison with the previous refresh document, which I think is CD 10.1. That I'm not going to debate that. Just point to in that document, the contribution of onshore wind was vital. Now it's mission critical. Some may say there's a difference between the two. In both there's a commitment to them, and I just highlight one passage in the in the forward to CD 10.1 on page 3, third last paragraph on the page, the Minister says a major review of the Scottish planning system is well underway, and it will continue as now to fully reflect the important role of renewable energy and energy infrastructure. And we can see that it's done that in the right places and with the appropriate protection for the environment. And that sums up our case as to what's happened. So yes, in terms of the 20, we have a target now. There may be more debate about the target and the extent to which it can be reached. That's all I wish to say about the contrast between the two.
So the next item there was reference to. Oh, sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Just to draw attention without going into them, to CD 15.7 and 14.9, which is the Brody's blog, and to our response to that blog by reference to timescales. But I'm not going. You have the documents. I'm just drawing attention to them in this context. Thank you.
Okay, so the next item there was to look at the references to landscape change, but unless anybody would like to add anything else, I'm quite happy that we've covered that. Thank you. Okay, so are there any other implications of the draft energy strategy and just transition plan on the proposal? Okay, we'll move on to the second document there, sorry, Mr. Harriet.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, recognising this as a draft plan, which is not technology specific, shall we say, we do draw limited weight from it. We just point out that there's commonality between it and the more advanced approved documents in terms of NPF4 and the onshore wind policy statement, where it talks about a significant increase in domestic production of clean energy is required to meet the targets. And it clearly envisages that happening alongside environmental enhancement, shall we call it, including peatland restoration to help address the nature crisis. So while the energy strategy and the just transition plan might be subject to change, I think the broad direction of travel set out in the documents, whereby an increase in generation across all technologies, I think it's highly unlikely to change. What is of interest is also the reference in the energy strategy to the future of electricity and energy export. That's something that's identified, and we touch upon that in our hearing statement. So there's clearly an ambition within the energy strategy to more than meet domestic demand. There's an export market there that the Scottish Government wishes to exploit. And in terms specifically of the just transition, I actually looked and found a definition for that in NPF4 in page 151, excuse me. And that's described as ending our contribution to climate change in a way that is fair and leaves no one behind. And I suppose different people could take different things from that depending what side you approach it. But I think it's difficult to translate into an individual project level. It's a broad concept, I think, to be achieved collectively, but it can relate to a range of matters, I think, in terms of involvement in decision making, involvement in plan formulation, seeking to achieve and maximise socioeconomic environmental benefits alongside energy generation. It's also, I think, about, particularly for the North East, there's reference in NPF4 to the transferable skills that exist in the oil and gas industry and maximising those skills in the just transition away to the renewables sector. Again, not onshore wind specific, there might be offshore roles there, but that's definitely something the National Planning Framework 4 touches upon the commentary on the North East. And I think crucially, it also, to me, relates to developing an energy system that maximises energy security and security of supplies. And we've touched upon that in previous hearing statements. It's still a very live issue. And I think that part of that just transition is reducing our exposure to the volatility of the energy markets, some things which are currently beyond our control. So just transition can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, but that's my view on it.
Does the applicant's team have any further to add before I go across to the council? Would you like to make any comments on the draft energy strategy and just transition plan?
No, no more than we have in our statement.
Okay, so we've talked there about the status of the documents and their relationship to NPF4, and we have what you've said in the in your statement. So are there any other matters that have been raised today or within the submissions that parties would like to address in relation to these documents?
I think so.
We really are getting through these quickly. So the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy, as parties were aware, the draft Scottish Biodiversity Strategy has also recently been published, and this was raised as a matter for us to discuss at the session. Again, we note what's been said within the hearing statements, but are there any specific points raised by other parties that participants would like to comment on today with regards to this draft document?
I don't think so, sir. No, it is in draft, and we have the Chief Planner's letter, which addresses this. I think we've also had submissions from Mr. Kelly, and we've responded to those. So, Mr. Yes, there's nothing. No, thank you.
No, I think just a brief, just to direct you to Appendix 1 of the hearing statement, where we have the submissions on the environmental enhancement measures and how we see that they tie up with various documents, including the draft strategy.
There's no hands there raised from anybody else. Would anybody else like to add anything on this one? No. Okay, so finally, I suppose then, before we go on to the concluding remarks from myself, I'd just like to check if participants have any other relevant matters that they'd like to discuss at this time as part of this additional. Yeah.
So you've given us a very fair opportunity. I think we've said what we want to say.
So as I say, we did briefly mention following the break the additional statement that we'll look to circulate after this meeting. So what may raise some of the matters that you wish to comment. But thank you very much for everybody for your contributions today. The comprehensive hearing statements that were submitted in advance certainly helped us to get through things fast, I think, today. I mean, we now have everything that we need to complete our report, notwithstanding the comments that have been made on the additional hearing statement we've mentioned. And we do fully anticipate passing our recommendations to the consent unit by our target date, which is currently listed as the 6th of April. Can I just check with Ms. Hayward that we've covered everything? Yeah. And with that, I'd just like to bring the hearing to a close. Thank you very much for your time, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Very much, sir.
Thank you.